Deonteleologist. Spaz is taking the position that Pascal's wager is unfairly maligned and is in fact a reasonably good argument. Deonteleologist taking the opposition. As always, when we base upon who concedes, we don't get a concession. We'll put it to a voting poll in which you, the audience, can vote on who you think won the debate. No time limit, no moderation. Thank you both for debating. You can get started.
Okay, cool. So I guess I can start off real quick. Pascal's wager obviously is a really famous argument in favor of adopting religion, regardless of whether we know God exists or not, which it basically just goes that let's say we think a particular religion or the existence of God, period, might be true or might not be true. Now, we can see that if it is true, then believing in God potentially carries an infinite reward, and disbelieving potentially carries an infinite cost. Whereas if it's not true, then there would only be finite material costs in the worst case from believing that God does exist, and only, in the best case, finite gains from believing that God doesn't exist. So it seems like since the loss to reward is so lopsided, there's a reasonable case for adopting a belief in God or a faith in a particular religion, regardless of whether you're actually epistemically sold on its truth. Is that fair?
Yeah, the argument. Yeah.
Yes. So that is the argument. Now, Pascal's wager is a pretty maligned argument in philosophy most of the time. Like, it's actually an argument that if you sort of take Philosophy 101, you'll see it raised and then purportedly debunked like one paragraph later in like a Phil 101 textbook. But I've always thought that the malignment or the criticism against Pascal's wager is holding it to a standard that we don't really seem to hold other arguments to. Like, well, for instance, there's a standard objection that, let's say, if we adopt Pascal's wager, then it seems like there could be an infinite number of possible gods that would either reward or punish you for any random thing. So, like, for instance, if I want to say, oh, there's a Christian God, he'll reward you with heaven if you believe in him. Well, you could also say, well, what if there's like a professor God who's going to actually torture you for eternity if you believe in Christianity because you don't have good evidentiary reasons to? Or let's say, we could even say, what if there was a God that is just a God that does nothing except give you infinite reward if you like give me $5 right now, and punishes you infinitely if you don't. So therefore we can make we can make these sort of like Pascal like arguments in favor of whatever we want to. And it seems like nobody would be able to, well, it seems like if you accept the original Pascal's argument, you would also have to accept all these. But I think that's just missing the point, because if you look at the actual sort of state or the state of knowledge that Pascal is actually presupposing when he makes the argument, he's presumably making it to somebody who's undecided about belief in Christianity. And if you're undecided about belief in Christianity, then obviously you don't think that Christianity is in this like infinitesimally improbable state where we can't even know whether the Christian God is more probable than any arbitrary deity I make up. And since that's actually not, this sort of like pure perfect agnosticism is actually not the epistemic state that's expected of, or that's not actually the target audience of the argument. The fact that it's possible for someone to have that epistemic state and then reject Pascal's wager isn't really all that strong of a criticism against the wager. You see what I mean?
Yeah. Is that your main counter argument, or was there another one you wanted to raise as well?
We can just go back and forth, but
Okay.
that'll be the main one.
Yeah, so I definitely agree that it would be a little bit ridiculous and sort of bad faith to hold the would-be believer, or sorry, the argument directed toward the would-be believer to a certain standard of like, well, there could be any logically possible religion, and in any of these religions there's any number of logically possible gods who could punish you or praise you for any number of possible things, right? Then they just have this sort of uh, what the hell are you supposed to do, right? And I think that that's correct, that that's a sort of standard that we just don't hold arguments to. We don't ask, when somebody's arguing for deontology, right? We don't argue that, well, there could be, an infinite number of different moral systems which could, make any number of things the cornerstone of their theory, right? That would be ridiculous. So I think, yeah, that's a fair point. I think the problem, though, is that um, while the objection to Pascal's wager that you discussed definitely goes too far, your response doesn't adequately address what I think is a more plausible version of that objection, which is not to base it on any logically possible religion where there could be a professor god or like a pina colada god or whatever, uh, but instead um, to sort of look at the actual facts of our human condition and see that there are a great many number of religions, some monotheistic religions, other polytheistic religions, and ones that actually, from the potential Christian's perspective, don't have any less of an epistemic warrant than the Christian God. Right? The reasons to believe in any of these gods are sort of, you could argue against this, but at least prima facie, all of these gods, the reason that anyone believes in them at all are because of some passed down tradition, some scripture, some religious stories that have been recorded and that posit the existence of this god as a sort of, or gods as sort of crucial characters in the story of humanity and the story of the universe. And for any one of the gods, it doesn't seem on the face of it that we have any greater justification for believing in the Christian one than, say, for believing in Zeus, the Greek god, or for believing in uh, a polytheistic religion like Hinduism. And so, while I grant that your hypothetical example with infinite potential gods is implausible, and that doesn't really put a dent in the argument. I think that actually just looking at the historical and cultural diversity of religions across humanity does put the pressure on the argument that we need. Because, on the one hand, if you believe in God, right, say you believe in a particular God, God A, let's say the God of Christianity, then if that God doesn't exist, it might be the case that whatever God does, if there is such a God, will punish you with eternal punishment for believing in the wrong God, right? You find in many religions that there's a rule of, I am the one God, the one only God, in monotheistic religions at least, or that there are at least punishments for worshiping false idols, right? For paying undue respect to gods other than the God that is supposed to exist according to that religion. So if you believe in the God of Christianity, but it turns out there's another God, you actually could end up in hell, right? With the terrible consequence that purportedly, according to Pascal's wager, only exists if you fail to believe in the Christian God and the Christian God exists. So what happens is your sort of decision matrix gets all out of whack given the possibility of all these other gods, each of which you have no greater justification for believing in than the Christian God.
Sure. So, just before I go into that, would you agree, even if that objection goes through, that all it really is just a case of underdetermination by an argument? Like
What
I
do you
could
mean
have,
by underdetermination here?
like we could say Pascal's wager argues for believing in some god, and it does that. In my opinion, it does it reasonably effectively. But then obviously it doesn't, like for instance, it doesn't let you choose between, like you said, it doesn't let you choose between Christianity and Islam. It wouldn't let you choose between being a Protestant or a Catholic, anything like that.
I don't see why it would justify believing in some god or other rather than suspending judgment or not believing in a god.
Okay. But so to go into this specific example, if you want to look at Islam, I actually don't think, for example, that Islam punishes you worse for believing in Christianity. than for just not believing in any God at all, right?
That may be true.
So, well, I mean, I'm about 99% sure that it is
Sure,
true.
sure. Let's
And it's
grant that
also
it's true.
true.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's also true of most of the different religions. Like, there aren't, I actually don't know what religion there is that will punish you infinitely or even really punish you that harshly for believing in a false God versus just like not worshiping any God. It seems like most religions offer you either some opportunity to receive a good afterlife, some possibility of a bad one. But I don't know of any religion that says, like, for example, if you choose the right God, infinite positive. If you choose the wrong God, infinite negative. But if you don't choose at all, then neutral. So if Pascal's wager goes through, like, just for the sake of simplicity, let's say that we're not decided between Christianity and Islam, then you could still make a sort of Pascal-like argument in favor of just flipping a coin and picking one or the other. That would seem to be fairly sound, actually.
I don't see how. I mean, the decision matrix would definitely be different.
So the decision matrix here is, let's say it could be, just for the sake of simplicity, let's say 33% chance Christianity, 33% chance Islam, 33% chance no God at all. Then let's say if I believe in Christianity,
One sec, though.
I'm,
I think this is a important um, built-in presupposition here is that you're presupposing that the only two possible religions are Christianity and Islam, versus what I was trying to argue is that it's
oh,
important that we have no reason to believe that any of the ones are more plausible than any of the others. And as you said, while other religions may not uh, punish you eternally for believing in the wrong God, you can still have a negative outcome in the afterlife, whether it's for failing to believe in the correct God or for some other reason that it might identify for you,
oh, yeah,
karma, being impious, or
yeah.
whatever. So
So
that's going
yeah,
to impact the decision matrix.
I obviously grant that. I just wanted to talk about this case because it's simple. But like, let's say we're talking Christianity, Islam, or nothing. Then the decision matrix looks like, let's say, believe in Christianity, 33% chance heaven, 63% or 66% chance go to hell. Islam looks the same way. But at that point, suspending judgment or refusing to worship any God would just get you 33% chance nothing and 66% chance eternal torment, which is worse than either of the other two. And so we would still have an argument. It would just be underdetermined as far as what religion we're advocating for, but we still have an argument for like theism in
Well,
general.
the crucial point is that, I mean, you just said, yes, I grant that, when I brought up the fact that there are plenty of other religions in which, if they turn out to be true, you can get a negative consequence in the afterlife for believing in Christianity or Islam. And you said, yeah, I grant that, but let me give you this example. And what I'm saying is that example doesn't apply, because it's not the case that the only two religions for which we can say that there is some degree of plausibility are these two. We have to take into account the the actual fact of there being a plethora of potential religions that could all be true, and not having any particular reason to trust one over the other. So you can't just say, well, if it were the case that either Christianity or Islam were the only possible outcomes, then the argument would go through. I mean, you can say that, but that doesn't make Pascal's wager plausible.
Hmm. Well, so what I'm saying is like we can have, which I agree that there is like a complex decision matrix, right? Like it's not just that simple Punnett square. But that doesn't mean that there's not sort of a clear indication of what sorts of behaviors are going to be more likely to be rewarded than others, which is just the same way we have to make decisions in the real world.
So, I mean, if you could construct the complex decision matrix that takes into account all of the religions that could potentially be true, and then you could show me based on that that actually Pascal's wager still suggests that you should be a Christian, then you'd have an argument to some degree. But I mean that would be an ambitious project, and if you have one, I'll gladly look at it. But I'm not sure how you could construct it.
Yeah, so I actually do have one. Just look at the debate chat.
Pascal's wager expanded.
This is a little bit of a meme, but somebody did post it earlier, so I thought I'd go ahead and share it with you.
Okay, and how am I supposed to read this?
So the up and down, like the ones on the y-axis, are possible religions you can have, whereas the ones on the x-axis are possible religions that could be true. So it looks to me like the best religion is. Seems like you could pick
Possible
between either
religions that
like.
could be true.
Yeah, it looks to me like Christian fundamentalism seems to edge out some of the other ones, but I think that might just be because Islam doesn't get as many. Islam doesn't get as many sort of like denominations, so that might be the reason why. But this is like
So
obviously this is a meme, and this is pretty vulgar reasoning,
yeah, I
which
mean
I
it's
think that's the reason.
interesting, but like
Yeah,
it definitely doesn't include all of the religions that could be true.
yeah, no, it's like I said, that's just a meme, and it's also pretty vulgar reasoning, which I think is part of the reason why you don't really see the argument actually used by religious people that much. But I do think
Yeah,
there's still something to it, which is that we don't necessarily have to construct the entire decision tree or the entire decision tree or the entire decision matrix like is attempted to be done here in this little meme. All that we have to do is figure out whether we can, or all we have to do is just figure out whether or not a particular decision is more likely to be rewarded in some of the different possible states than other possible states. And it's also not necessarily mutually exclusive what you could do to maximize your probability. And this, like I said, this is sort of vulgar reasoning that no religious person actually uses. So I'm just gonna leave it here, or I'm just gonna say a couple more words about this and then move on to the next argument. But you could technically still do multiple. Like you could try to maintain plausibly good karma while still holding to a monotheistic religion. Or you could try to, for instance, you could hold to a particular monotheistic religion or non-monotheistic religion and just avoid disrespecting any other deity due to the possibility of them actually existing and punishing you, which would probably be actually the correct action to do in this kind of like epistemic state.
sure. Another problem. I mean, so I'll grant that in theory you could put this grand table together, and there could be one decision that, based on the values that you assign and the probabilities that you assign, that could be the way to go. But that rests on your assigning certain probabilities and certain values to certain outcomes. And while I said earlier that like it's not the case that we necessarily have any higher uh, or we have any greater warrant or justification to believe in one religion rather than any other, there's further the epistemic problem of assuming that whatever religious tradition or whatever religion, and given the details that have been passed down, um, accurately reflect the desires, um, consequences of sort of the desires of the deity in question, the consequences of believing or not believing, et cetera, et cetera. You have to assume that all of these are accurately passed down, and not only that they're accurately passed down, but that the sort of initial transmission was also an accurate reflection of the sort of metaphysical deistic makeup of the universe, given the postulates of a specific religion. And that is a further claim that I don't know how you could possibly justify.
So I don't know if you have to assume that those things are true, or if you just have to assume that we have like a reasonable amount of credence that they might be true.
Right. No, that's correct.
I
The
think,
latter. Yeah.
like I was saying earlier, the target audience of this argument is presumably going to believe that there is some sort of reasons to believe, like let's say you could have somebody who already accepts the argument from religious experience, or who believes that based on historical testimony, there's some reasonably high probability that Christianity is true, but it's just not 100% sure, or you could even say it's fairly unlikely.
So, I mean, I'm confused
Or
because while it's true that that Pascal's wager is supposed to be directed at someone who can, in principle, be convinced, I don't see why it has to be addressed towards someone who's not very skeptical. Because Pascal's wager, as it's set up, um, even a person who is, at the time, a committed atheist should, given Pascal's reasoning, actually recognize that they're better off sort of willing themselves to believe in the Christian God. So I don't see why it has to be directed at someone who's already sort of sympathetic.
oh yeah, so this is sort of a bit of a tangent, but I think another function Pascal's wager has is that it lets us explore some of the problems with some versions of like decision theory in the same way that other like it is frankly just kind of like a paradox in the same way. You know what the like the St. Petersburg paradox is?
I
It's
don't.
like, let's say that I offer you a bet where you get to play a game where you're going to get a 50-50 chance of having $2, and then a 25% chance of getting $4, and then a 1/8 chance of getting $8. And the argument go like it goes on infinitely, of course. And the argument goes that technically this bet gives you infinite expected utility, since your expected utility in round one is $1. In round two, it's also $1. Round three, it's also $1. So one plus one plus one infinitely many times. It has infinite expected payoff. So everybody should give their entire life savings to anyone offering this bet. But of course, nobody would actually want to take that bet if it costs more than $2 or $3, because it's so unlikely to actually get payoff. And we can see how that sort of explores the same problems with the way we understand making decisions based on like low probabilities of high payoffs that Pascal's wager explains for the committed atheist, right? And I think there are arguments from symmetry, and I think there are arguments from sort of just general like incredulity about this sort of like low probability, high payoff gamble that mean there are fair reasons for the committed atheist to reject Pascal's wager. But I think because so much of the exploration of it has gone into, or so much of the exploration into it seems to have gone into this case where somebody thinks they have no reason at all to believe, say, in one God over another, or no reason at all to believe in one God over any other like possible logically existent God, then you're basically evaluating the argument at its weakest possible point. And I agree that it's not sound at its weakest possible point. But I think if you look at the sort of situation that I think Pascal actually believed in, like I think Pascal actually believed that there wasn't really any clear, like he was genuinely sort of like coin flip level unsure whether Christianity was true or not. And he meant this argument to be sort of a reason to go on believing in religion even when you're not sure about it, which is different than an argument to adopt a religion that you see as just completely like epistemically implausible.
Okay.
And that sort of disconnect is why I think the argument has become like unfairly maligned.
Okay, so let's shift now to, let's suppose that actually, right, the only two options are atheism or Christianity, and we actually have Pascal talking to someone from his community who knows of no other religion, and who's either going to be agnostic or atheist or um, Christian, right? And Pascal proposes the wager, and he says, "Look, it doesn't matter how infinitesimally unlikely it is that God exists, because there's only two options. The fact that it's infinite positive utility and infinite negative utility is going to make, infinite positive, utility or infinite negative utility is going to mean that with the expected utility calculus, it's still the case that you ought to believe in God, no matter how improbable it is, right?" And so, again, just imagining that it's Pascal, this person, and the Christian God. Like you said, well, I mean, something that you said, and I'm not sure whether you meant it this way, was that Pascal is making an argument for believing in religion, even if you think that, on its own it's unjustified, or you have, no good reason apart from this argument. But I don't
Well,
think that's exactly what Pascal is saying. I think this is an argument specific to the Christian religion. You can't run this argument for any old religion. um Sorry, I feel like my mic might have just disconnected for a sec because I got a phone call.
no, yeah, I've been hearing you.
Okay. Yeah, so this is an argument specific to the Christian religion. I heard, did you want to speak up on something here?
Oh yeah, I was just going to say, the argument that you were describing, I think, is unsound, and I think there are actually. I just want to be clear that this is my view. I do think there are like genuine objections to Pascal's wager, which is why I'm not trying to make the argument that it's actually like truly sound, or that it's at least not that it's sound for any target. But I think, for instance, just because we might reject the argument in the case of the person who thinks it's infinitesimal, or who think it's like really, really unlikely.
I was
Like,
trying to say that actually, even if you think it's really unlikely, Pascal's wager goes through, as long as you accept his premises, because no matter how unlikely it is, the fact that heaven gives you positive infinite utility, no matter how small the percentage is of the, God's existing, because it's infinite, the utility goes to infinity. And no matter how unlikely it is, and if you don't believe, the negative utility goes to infinity still. The expected utility goes to infinity. So what I was arguing was, the person, it doesn't matter how infinitesimal the person believes are the probability of God's existence. So there, I think the argument would go through, and I was going to raise a separate criticism, but I wasn't trying to say that the infinitesimal nature of the possibility of God's existence was a problem for the argument. On the contrary.
okay, so sure.
Okay, so even if this is the case, because Pascal's argument is specific to the Christian God, right? And the Christian God is supposed to be all knowing, all powerful, and all good. There are serious problems for uh, what we can walk away from the argument concluding, because it seems to follow that for every person who never ponders the wager, or never even is informed of the Christian religion and the possibility that this God exists, and that if you believe in the God, then you'll have heaven. If you don't, you have hell. It follows that God is unnecessarily and really cruelly punishing with eternal hell and eternal suffering the majority of the population of the earth.
Right. So I might point out the original argument actually is agnostic to the existence of hell. but just uses the sort of the only thing it actually uses is just the infinite utility of heaven, but it doesn't actually make any. That's another criticism that I've seen other sort of other people
So
make
even
against the argument is that it actually neglects the infinite disutility and only talks about the case of infinite utility.
so, then you have the problem of God arbitrarily excluding the vast majority of the population from heaven, right? From eternal bliss and happiness. For what reason? Just because they didn't happen to find out about his existence and take the leap of faith. That does not sound like the actions of an all knowing, all powerful, all good God.
Okay. So is this, I just want to be clear, is this just like the regular problem of evil argument? Or is
No,
it specific? Okay, so how does it specifically apply to refuting Pascal's wager?
because Pascal's wager is specifically about the Christian God. And so, and if we know that the Christian God is said to be all knowing, all powerful, and all good, and yet he is performing this arbitrary act of exclusion of the majority of the population from heaven, from eternal happiness, uh, that does not seem like the sort of thing that an all knowing, all powerful, all good God would do. At least an all good God would give everyone the chance uh, of entering heaven, right? So you have the first problem of just excluding a bunch of people because they are never informed of the religion of Christianity or the possibility of the Christian God's existence and the reward that would come with believing in the Christian God. And then further, you have the problem of the Christian God rewarding people simply in virtue of their deciding to believe a certain thing, right? Not because they're, a virtuous person and they're, donate much to charity and they, feed the hungry and they help the sick. None of this. They're not being rewarded for doing any good. They're being rewarded for believing in the existence of this God. And in the case of those who accept the sort of Pascal style wager, they're literally being rewarded for following their self-interest, right? This just does not seem at all like this sort of rewarding that an all-knowing, all-powerful, all-good God would do. And it seems to me that the only plausible response to that is that God works in mysterious ways or whatever. Sure, if that's the most plausible response, then I'm just going to fundamentally disagree. But I don't know how else one could respond.
Sure. I mean, the issue with that though is that all we have like that just seems like a sort of a straightforward argument against Christianity. And we can have
Well,
arguments against Christianity that we think are more or less implausible. And my whole defense of Pascal's wager is just that, let's say we can just grant, like we can grant that there are some people who have reasons to think that Christianity is astronomically unlikely to be true, or who think, say, that it's completely impossible for Christianity to be true. And I would actually just grant that the argument is not going to be motivating. Even if we can say, like, abstractly, the argument would go through, it's obviously not going to be motivating.
yes, but
But
the problem is not that it's not motivating to those people. The problem is that they never even get the chance to consider the proposition.
okay, so what I'm talking about, I just want to be clear, I'm talking about someone who the argument is run on. There could be reasons they could have for thinking or for not being motivated. Like they could ponder the problem of evil, or they could make the argument that, like, I've heard people say, the existence of God is contradictory. You could say stuff like that. Or they could just believe strongly in another religion, or they could just think that it's like really unlikely God exists and they're just not willing to gamble on something that unlikely. And those are all legitimate objections. Like I have always conceded there are legitimate objections to Pascal's wager so that it doesn't go through for every person. But I think it actually should go through in the majority of cases that a person is eligible to be persuaded at all. So, for instance, somebody who was actually sort of trying to decide whether, especially if we were talking more in the original context where Pascal actually lived, somebody who was actually sort of deciding whether to keep their religion or to discard it would probably find Pascal's wager to be fairly persuasive. And I think you can sort of implicitly see this in the way a lot of evangelism actually works in the real world, is people do talk about sort of the promise of eternal bliss if you throw your lot in with the right deity, right? At least in some cases, people do run basically this argument, and it basically does work. And I
Okay.
see a lot. I see a lot of sort of criticisms of Pascal's wager that the reason I think they're unfair is because they're just pointing out that somebody could have other very strong reasons to sort of reject the conclusion anyway, which I think is fair. There are still like valid paths you could take to reject Pascal's wager, and there are people who probably are just not in a position where it even makes sense to object it or to accept it anyway. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the argument doesn't do work. I think it actually, if we take it seriously, it should do a pretty large amount of work. For instance, I think Pascal's wager is a good argument against at least some forms of agnosticism, because you wouldn't ordinarily, like, you wouldn't, if you're going to take the line that you actually sort of don't have an opinion one way or the other about like Christianity in particular, it seems like you would be motivated, or would want to be motivated, by the lopsided decision matrix. You know what I mean?
Already granted that. I already
Okay.
granted that there are people who, if they believe that, Pascal has set up the wager honestly, right? Even if they believe it's just marginally possible that God exists because of the infinite nature of the utility, positive or negative, that it will go through. But I, I'm a little bit puzzled by your response over the past couple minutes, because you're saying, look, I grant that the argument is not sound, that there are many people for whom Pascal's wager will not go through. But I think that Pascal's wager gets sort of an unfair bad rap because there are also people for whom Pascal's wager would go through. But I don't see how that's a defense of Pascal's wager at all. I mean, there are all sorts of bad arguments that some people will believe because they're inclined to accept the premises and they see that the conclusion follows. The fact that some people will accept the argument is not a point in favor of it.
Mm, so, what I'm trying to say here is that we have a premise. Like, let's say I'm thinking about how to actually describe what this unstated premise is, but we'll say the premise is that Christianity in particular is more likely than other religions to be true. Or we could say the premise is that we have some reasonably high degree of credence in the particular religion, or the particular religion that's being argued for, compared to other alternative possibilities. And this is a premise that we can have arguments for or against that could be valid or not. But the point is that given this premise, the argument is sound. And the premise is the sort of premise that would actually have to be accepted by most people who you would want to run religious arguments for, or who you would want to target with religious arguments in general. So I think we
Why would
both
they have
agree.
to accept that? I mean, I think
Well,
you're relativizing to Pascal's context, and you're saying, well, look, the argument's only meant to work on, the sort of people who are already inclined to accept it. That doesn't mean that it's a powerful argument.
well, every argument can only be run, or say every sort of like, maybe not every, but the majority of arguments can only be run on people who are inclined to accept the premises.
No, you can run an argument on anyone, and if they don't accept the premises, then they don't accept the premises. That doesn't mean that the premises are false.
Sure. Well, I mean, any argument. Let me restate that. So, in the case of any argument, somebody could reject the premises. But most arguments that we have about religion, especially actually most arguments that are had about metaphysics in general, it seems like there's at least one premise that's really relatively suspect. Like there aren't that many arguments in philosophy in general that seem to be truly airtight. Like nobody can reject a premise. So most of the time, what we're looking at when we talk about other arguments is we're looking at a situation where, well, okay, you might be inclined to accept a particular premise, and we can explore what follows from accepting that premise. Or you might not, and then you're not going to. Now, I think Pascal's wager is just the same as every other argument. Like it's relatively on footing with other arguments in philosophy and other arguments in religion.
But that doesn't mean that it's good. Like the fact that it's on par with other arguments doesn't mean, like, you have to show that those other arguments are good for me to accept that, oh, okay, Pascal's wager is also somewhat good. Like it can be on par with a bunch of arguments that are not good.
Yeah. I mean, if you take the line, actually, I will concede this. If you take the line that sort of like the majority of arguments in this category are bad, then Pascal's wager is also going to be bad.
I mean,
yeah, you know what? I might actually go ahead and concede the debate on that point.
Okay. Yeah.